So this is Unit 3, Chapter 11, Part 1. So I've separated into two parts. The first part is going to be sustaining biodiversity, as it says right here. And the second part is going to be evolution and biodiversity. So the whole idea behind how organisms actually became to be as diverse as they are. So our objectives for the first part: describe the significance of wild species in order to list the root causes of extinction and explain the role of human activities play in extinction, discuss the laws that have been put in place to protect wild species, and describe and assess different strategies to protect life. So here, first of all, the importance of wild species. So it's important to recognize that there are two values that wild species can have. First is the instrumental value. Second is the intrinsic value. So the instrumental value is usually our primary way that is used for putting a purpose to a species. So instrumental is their usefulness to us, right? So the whole idea that what can they do for us? And so that is what makes it the number one, or the main type of value that we consider when talking about how important a species is. So examples: agriculture, forestry, aquaculture, animal. So in essence, anything that benefits something else, especially us as humans. To some extent taking part of its ecological role, but not really. That is more intrinsic value. So the intrinsic value is more, it's inherent, right? It allows to, it deserves to live because it does. Just as much as we do, it does too. So regardless of how useful it is to us as humans, it should be able to live. So one example is the aesthetic or visual appreciation. So, oh, it's just so pretty, it's nice to look at, it makes me calm, things like that. And the other is just the simple ethical decision to protect them. This whole idea that they deserve to be here as much as anything or anyone else. So when we move to the next slide, there are three types of extinction. The one that we are most familiar with is our biological extinction, which means the species is no longer found anywhere on the earth. And so that's when we think of extinction, that's what we immediately and usually think about. But when we look at local and ecological, we can see how they make sense too. So local species is no longer found in an area where it once inhabited, but is still found somewhere else in the world. So let's say there was a huge fire or a huge deforestation that made all these organisms leave, like maybe all the tree frogs leave one area of Florida, right? And so they're normally there. They may not be, and they're not there anymore, but maybe they've moved all to a part in Louisiana. And so it's just a local extinction where they're not in Florida anymore. The next one is ecological. So few members of the species are left. It can no longer play its ecological roles in the biological community where it's found. So these are three good vocabulary words that you should be familiar with. So what leads to extinction? So extinction is the, this in essence is, close. In essence, extinction means the end. Right? No more. And so, but before you get to extinction, right? This is the third step, right? Then before they're extinct, they are endangered, right? And so there are so few survivors that the species could soon become extinct over all or most of its natural range. And then the first thing that we recognize is the species being threatened. So threatened can also be, they sometimes use the term vulnerable. So the species is still abundant, but the numbers are declining to such an extent that there is fear that it could become endangered at some point. So it goes from threatened to endangered and finally to extinction. So you have, in essence, two ways or two steps or two opportunities to stop the end of a species or the decline of a species before they actually become extinct. So one thing that's important to know and recognize is that endangered species share the same characteristics, and these are the ones below. So low reproductive rate, specialized feeding habits, etc., etc., etc. And there are some things that you can recognize that you may have noticed between species when we talked about R selected or K selected species. So keep in mind which one, even just not even looking at that, R or K, do you think are the ones that tend to be or have that characteristics of being endangered? And so if you guessed K or said K, that is correct because they tend to be more vulnerable. So these are K species. Right? So there are five primary contributors to loss of biodiversity, and so we use this acronym HIPPO to help us to remember. The H stands for habitat destruction, degradation, and fragmentation. And this, by far, is our greatest threat. And so that's something that you'll always hear about, right? The greatest threat. What is the greatest threat? And the greatest threat is habitat destruction, degradation, and fragmentation. So destruction means getting rid of it. So no more, right? Degradation could be like polluting. It's still there, but it's not good enough to use. And fragmentation is sections are taken away. It's kind of, when I think of fragmentation, I think of over the hedge. And so during the winter, when those animals were hibernating, they built a community. So you had, all these trees, and so they built this community. So this is all that was left, and houses were along the side, along the outside of these animals' home, and they didn't quite know. Animals don't really think the way that we as humans do, but the movies always make them seem like they do. So the animals had to live in a smaller area and learn how to survive in a smaller area. So they didn't take it all the way away, but they fragmented that area. Invasive non-native, we'll learn more about these and the reasons why they do that. They outcompete resources and have no natural predators. This is something that you're familiar with. Population growth of humans. So recognizing that when humans grow, we have to take care of, get rid of habitats. Overgrazing occurs due to, needing meat, which is what we learned last chapter, right? Okay, so finally, pollution caused by human activities. I normally don't like the word pollution by itself, but this is an overarching category. So pollution to mean water pollution and air pollution and et cetera, et cetera. Excuse me. And then finally, overuse, overharvesting, overhunting. In essence, exploitation, right? Using too much of something. The illegal trade and the exotic pet industry are primary contributors, right? So the illegal trade of ivory, and we talked about this before, and exotic pet industries, so people wanting to have pet lions or monkeys, and so people will hunt them in the wild or hunt the babies or the cubs in the wild and bring them back and sell them and make lots of money. So what was put in place to protect wild species? So the first thing done was the Lacey Act in 1900, and it forbid the interstate commerce of illegally killed wildlife. So instead of people being able to you would kill it in one place, but then you can sell it, and it was legal in another state, and so that wasn't really working very well. And so they put this act in place to keep people from saying, oh, well, I didn't have it over there, I had it here in the first place. So the fact that you couldn't kill it one place and bring it to another place. The next one is the Endangered Species Act, which you should be more familiar with, and we'll talk more about that later. And then there was a Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. So what they realized is that there was still a huge issue with ivory from elephant tusks, or even the fur of other things, or how they have that shark fin soup in China, things like that. And so several countries came together for this CITES, and the Convention on International Trade and Endangered Species, and it focused on wildlife trade and wildlife parts. And so that during that time was when the international trade on ivory was banned during that convention. So how do we protect these wildlife species? So you have two organizations. You have the National Marine and Fisheries Service, and you have the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. And so National Marine Wildlife is responsible for identifying and listing endangered and threatened species. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services designate a species as endangered or threatened. So they came up with the categories that must happen. So the NMFS, decisions are made on biological factors alone without considering economic or political factors. So that allows you to recognize what role does it play ecologically. So this is its ecological role. Right? And so sometimes they will take economic factors into consideration when they're deciding how to protect the endangered habitat or recovery plans. And so, but that's the only case. So if you want to designate a species as endangered, or if the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services think it should be, they have to do three things. First, they have to list the species, saying this is an endangered species. Next, they have to designate the critical habitat areas where the species is found. And last, they have to develop a recovery plan to help the species survive and thrive. So it's not enough just to say this is an endangered species. They have to designate the habitat, like say this is where they're found. Because these species are considered to be endangered, we have to protect this area. And then finally, you have to develop a recovery plan. What are you going to do, or what are you going to enforce to ensure that the species survive? So when we look at this, we think of, going back. So when you hear designate the critical habitat of areas or species found. So they were able to find what are considered to be hotspots. And these are areas of critical biodiversity. So in 2000, a study by the Nature Conservancy found that many of the country's rarest and most imperiled species are concentrated in a few hotspots. So recognizing that, of all the endangered species or threatened species that there are, a lot of them live in certain areas. So these are just the top six areas in the U.S., right? But there are, I think, 25 or 22 of the whole country, world, that we'll talk about later, and you'll do a little activity for it. So I can tell you those there. And it makes sense. What do we notice that's the same about these areas? So they have a relatively consistent climate as far as temperature and precipitation. And so organisms, just like we noticed about when we talked about the biomes, organisms, there's no adjustment or things that have to happen, and so the organisms can just live there. So here are our top 25 biodiversity hotspots. This is of the whole world, right? And we'll do an activity with them. So if we notice again, they're kind of harboring around this whole area just a little bit north and south of the equator, right? If the equator goes along about like, here, y'all know I can't draw a straight line with this. Then they hover, around, if this is, 0 up to 60 north and south, right? And so in little areas here where it is still relatively warm, right? And so they've zoomed in. I don't know why they have an overlay of the countries here, but to zoom in, and we'll talk, like I said, and do more with this and as an assignment for you all. So ESA, again, this is the Endangered Species Act. Okay, it's going to be hard for me, but I'll write it. Right? So the Endangered Species Act was amended to help landowners protect endangered species. So if I have a big plot of land, but in that land that I own, there are some endemic species that live there, or species that are on the endangered species list that live there. So how can I, as a landowner, still benefit from being able, or still do things that I want to do? And so they came up with these 3 additions or amendments to the Endangered Species Act to allow landowners to have a role in protecting the endangered species. So habitat conservation plans, so to design and strike compromise between the interests of landowners and those endangered and threatened species. So landowners, developers, or loggers are allowed to destroy some critical habitat in exchange for taking steps to protect members. So here I can do what I want. I can take the land down, probably get rid of a little bit more species, but I am agreeing to protect the members of the species. And so it's like a give and take. Safe harbor agreements, landowners voluntarily agree to take specified steps to restore yada yada yada, right? But what do they get? They get technical help and assurances that the natural resources involved will not face future restrictions once the agreement expires. So if I agree to do this now and 10 years down the line the agreement expires, the government can't come back and say you can't do this anymore. And then finally, voluntary candidate conservation agreements. So again, landowners agree to take specific steps to help conserve a species whose population is declining, but not yet listed as endangered or threatened. So again, they get technical help, government subsidies, money always does the trick. And again, assurances that nothing will come later to negate the agreement that they came up with in the first place. So how can we protect wild species? There are several ways that we can do it. We can do the Sanctuary Act. So these are the Sanctuary Way. So these are protected areas. So in like a national park, you'll have this place, and that national park is protected. So once you get into that national park, you can no longer hunt the deer. You can no longer hunt the animals that are there, right? And so they have these big fences that are around, right? And this is the protected area for the animals. And then everything outside of here is liable for, the animals aren't really protected in there anymore. Next, you have gene banks where you can preserve the genetic information. So, in essence, you have DNA or some type, or a seed, or a DNA seed of a certain plant, or some other type of genetic information, and it's sort of like a freezer bank. Right? And so they have these, tons and tons and tons of freezers that hold this DNA, these seeds, this genetic information that can then be used later for research, or even to reinstate a species, right? Or next, you have botanical gardens, provides education about plant conservation. So there's a huge one on New York Avenue in Northeast. So the National Botanical Gardens, you should go. It's really good. But they have different areas where they have different plants, native plants growing mostly. So it's really pretty to go when the cherry blossoms go. A lot of people go to the waterfront, but sometimes cherry blossoms or azaleas are really big there, can go, and you can go see. And then they also have educational tours and pamphlets and different things to educate about how you can conserve plants. Wildlife farm, so raising wildlife for commercial sale. So this decreases the need to kill in the wild, right? So it's similarly to our aquaculture, where if I can get them from a tank, then I don't need to get the fish from the ocean, and possibility to over harvesting or different things like that. And finally, zoos and aquariums, which are probably the things that we are most familiar with. So you preserve some individuals of critically endangered animal species with long-term goal of introducing to wildlife to protected wild habitats. So we're not bringing them back to the wild. So not the wild, but more so bringing them back to something like a sanctuary, right, in the end. So it's protected, it's a wild habitat, but they're still being watched and monitored.